Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's India visit is facing criticism for reasons more than one. The most disturbing reason being his proximity with Khalistani separatists. And now it has come to light, one convict, Khalistani terrorist Jaspal Atwal, was invited to an official dinner. Atwal is a convict and he once attacked Canadian politician Ujjwal Dosanjh. Ujjwal Dosanjh survived the attack and went on to become the Premier of British Columbia. He has some advice for the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government. Right, we're now joined by Ujjwal Dosanjh, who's former Premier of British Columbia and former Minister of Health for Canada. He was attacked by Jaspal Atwal in 1985 but never was convicted. Jaspal Atwal presence in Canadian Prime Minister delegation, and that story that is developing, and that particular event has generated a lot of controversies. What's your take on that?
Well, I believe it's troubling to have someone, a convicted attempted assassin, in the delegation led by the Prime Minister of the country. I know that he may not be part of the official delegation, but he is visiting India at the same time and was invited to the High Commissioner's dinner. Therefore, I assume that that he is somewhat known to the Prime Minister's delegation and the High Commission.
Right, Mr. Dosanjh, the Canadian High Commission has given an official invite to Atwal to attend a dinner on 22nd, that is today, with the Prime Minister in Delhi, and then withdrew it. What do you think? Did they realize the blunder that they were making, or was it a kind of damage control, but little late that came after the damage was done?
I believe that that the whole trip of Mr. Trudeau has been essentially marred by all of these kinds of things. First, they didn't want to meet the Chief Minister of Punjab, and then they decided to mend fences and meet with him, and then this controversy erupted. And when you look at that, it sort of one is baffled by the fact that he is included in the High Commissioner's dinner as a man who had attacked someone like me back in the 80s. He's fairly well known. Shortly after that, he was acquitted of the charges, but then he went on to attempt to assassinate the visiting Punjabi cabinet minister. And I believe that that kind of man who served time in jail as a result of that conviction ought to have been known to the Prime Minister's office.
All right, Mr. Dosanjh, did Atwal attack you because you espoused the cause of United India while a lot of radicals were talking about Khalistan in Canada in those days? Could you please throw some light on that?
Well, that was the reason. I mean, I was one of the very few people in Canada across the country that spoke up at that time. And I spoke up for two reasons. One, for the unity and integrity of India and sort of where people should be able to live in peace with each other, but also more importantly for the unity of the Indian community, where we have people from different faiths living here, and we want to make sure that we live in peace amongst ourselves and with the rest of the Canadian population, and that we had a huge, long struggle to gain basic rights in Canada for the last 100 years. And I didn't want that struggle to be reversed, those rights to be reversed, or us to lose ground by these kinds of activities. So I spoke out both for Canada and for India at that time.
Very aptly put, Mr. Dosanjh. And then the world knows about the fact that he attacked Malkiat Singh Sindhu and was convicted for it. And despite that, he was invited by the Canadian High Commissioner. What do you have to say about that?
Well, he attacked me first, and he, of course, denied the attack, and he was on various technicalities. He was acquitted by the judge. And I said, you know, fine, justice has been done, and if the Crown has not been able to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, so be it. But then he went on to obviously attempt to assassinate the visiting Punjabi cabinet minister, Balkit Singh Sidhu, on Vancouver Island. And for that, he was convicted and served many years in jail. And, he is obviously a bit of a controversial chap, as you indicated that he has some recent convictions with respect to insurance, auto insurance fraud. I'm not aware of that, but I'm learning those from the newspapers.
Mr. Dosanjh, do you think his previous actions are reasons good enough for the Canadian government to keep a distance?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not even the attempted assassination of the visiting Punjabi cabinet minister or assault against me. Just the insurance fraud would have kept someone away from the High Commissioner's dinner or reception in India. And I believe that obviously the Prime Minister's office and his security apparatus have failed in this regard. And, I'm somewhat surprised and disappointed.
All right. And what should the Canadian government do to make things better now that it's happened, now that the invite was sent and withdrawn later? What do you think could be done now?
Well, I think that it encourages them indirectly by appearing at their events, by appearing on their stages, by appearing in parades where some of the mass murderers like Talvinder Parmar, or the murderer of Air India, who bombed Air India, where their portraits are glorified. So I believe that in fact, it's all right for the Prime Minister of Canada to say we believe in the unity of India and integrity of India and that we won't support Khalistan. But what really needs to be done, and where I think Indian politicians have been absolutely inept, has been at the framing of the question. The question ought not to be framed by politicians like, Mr. Trudeau, do something about these people in Canada. That's not the issue, because Canada would simply say to you, we are a free country. People are free to express their views. So is India, I point out to everybody. In India, we're free to express our views as well. So the question is not whether they express their views and where. The question is whether the government, cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister, and other politicians in this country of all major political parties associate themselves with the Khalistanis in their functions, in their parades, when they parade the floats with pictures of martyrs, so-called martyrs, like the mass murderer of Air India, Talvinder Parmar, and other militants who've been violent. When they parade those posters in those parades openly and shout Khalistan slogans and glorify those murderers, it is then that those politicians attend those functions, they adorn those stages. That is what's wrong. If the politicians must cease and desist from doing that. If they do that, Khalistan problem in Canada would disappear.
Right. Mr. Dosanjh, now that you've explained that some steps that Canada can now take to better things, there's more that India would be asking at this point in time, because the damage has been done. The High Commission has, I reiterate that the High Commission has withdrawn the invite. The Canadian Prime Minister has also clarified that action will be taken. Do you think there's anything else that Canadians can still do? Because there's a shadow of Khalistan that would dominate the ties between the two countries, and that shadow will remain. Is there anything that the Canadian Prime Minister could do at this point in time to get rid of that shadow?
Well, I'm saddened, both as an Indian by heritage and a Canadian by citizenship, that this trip hasn't gone well. It could have gone well. The government of Canada knew that India was concerned about the Khalistani activities here. It hasn't gone as well as it could have been, but I'm still hoping that it can be salvaged when the two prime ministers meet in a few hours, I assume.
All right, and now that you've said that, this trip has not gone as planned, do you think, is there any message that you have for the Canadian Prime Minister now?
Well, Mr. Trudeau, he's a smart man. He doesn't need any message from me, but I think it's important. I'm sure it's clear to him that issue isn't the unity and integrity of India. The issue isn't really the question of free speech. The issue is whether or not he, his government, and other politicians in this country and his colleagues have implicitly or indirectly or directly supported the activities of Khalistanis by being in their functions, by being at the stages where murderers are glorified, where Khalistan slogans are raised. And I think that that's an issue that he needs to pay attention to.